You. We listen to each other.
Together, we push the field forward of increasing participation of under-resourced and underserved families in research.
And increasing outcomes for children, families, and teachers.
And improving research
and bringing greater awareness to the community.
We are ASD.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 11th Annual Community Autism Conference, Safe and Sound, Safety Planning for Individuals with Autism. My name is Sue Lee, a project scientist at UCLA, and I'm so excited to be here with you all. Our community partner, Liz Rogers from Eastern Los Angeles Regional Center, had originally planned to co-facilitate this conference with me, but due to unexpected circumstances, she was called away and is unable to join us today. But we deeply appreciate her contributions to organizing this conference and want to thank her for her dedication. This conference is hosted in partnership between UCLA and our community partners as part of the AirB network. And today we're going to focus on essential safety planning strategies to support individuals with autism in various settings. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. First, for our Spanish-speaking attendees, para escuchar el evento en español, en la barra de herramientas de Zoom, haga clic en la opción Interpretación y, por favor, elija la opción Español. And our English-speaking attendees, you don't need to do anything, so just sit back and relax and enjoy the conference. And I'd like to give a special thanks to our interpreters, Dr. Francisco Reynosa Segovia and Ms. Brenda Martinez, and also our lab coordinator, Ms. Consuelo Garcia, who works so hard to make this conference available in Spanish every year. And if you have questions for our speakers today or to the organizers, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. You can also type your questions in Spanish or Korean. And for our Korean speakers, 한국어가 더 편하신 관객분들 중에 오늘 발표자들께 질문사항 있으시면 Q&A 기능에 한국어로 질문 입력해 주시면 제가 적절한 타이밍에 전달해 드리도록 하겠습니다. 그리고 한국어 이벤트는 추후에 다른 기회에 자리를 마련할 계획입니다. And we're going to be uploading our conference recordings and materials to our website, airbnetwork.org. We'll also email additional resources after the conference. And towards the end of the conference, we're going to post our evaluation survey link in the chat. And your feedback is really important to us, so please tell us how you like the conference at the end. Okay. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Connie Kasri and Ms. Pamela Colvin-Lee, who will kick off our conference with their opening remarks. Dr. Kasri is a distinguished professor of human development and psychology and education at UCLA, a founding member of the Center for Autism Research and Treatment at UCLA, and a world-renowned expert in early social communication development in autism. She's the developer of Jasper, an evidence-based intervention for children with autism, and also the leader of the AirB network. And we also have Ms. Pamela Colvin-Lee, who is a longtime community partner of AirB, and she's the autism coordinator at the South Central Los Angeles Regional Center. She provides training, information, and resources to professionals, families, and individuals with autism. So everyone, please welcome Dr. Kasri and Ms. Colvin-Lee.
Great. Well, welcome everyone to our 11th community conference. And it's really an honor to be here alongside my esteemed colleague and community partner, Pamela Colvin-Lee from South LA Regional Center. We're really thrilled to share this conversation with you today. And this conference is part of an ongoing academic community partnership that's dedicated to improving access to high-quality autism interventions. We're all members of the Autism Intervention Network for Behavioral Health, which is funded by our federal government, the Maternal and Child Health Bureau. And we collaborate directly with schools, homes, community health centers to support autistic children and their families in ways that truly matter to our communities. So each year, this conference brings together families, educators, professionals to connect, to learn, to exchange insights. And we're so grateful for your presence and your participation. So let's get started. I'm pleased to turn it over to Pam.
Wow, thank you so much, Connie. I'm real excited to be here. Welcome and hello to everyone. Listen, this year our community has spoken and we've listened. Because here today, we're here with an esteemed group of folks to talk about and address a critical and deeply personal topic, just keeping our children with autism safe. As an autism specialist with the South Central LA Regional Center, I encounter a lot of parents that come and share their concerns, they share their fears, they share their needs about the safety of their children, whether it's at home, the community, at school, or just anywhere that they're not present with them or by their side. We know that this is an urgent and important conversation to have, and this is a safe place for us to have this conversation. Today, we're honored to bring together a diverse group of folks with insight and a lineup of speakers, including researchers, community professionals, individuals with autism, and their family members. Each of them brings a unique expertise and lived experience that help us better to understand the challenges they have gone through, but more importantly, to find some solutions to ensure the safety and well-being of our children. Listen, we're glad to be here. We're grateful that you are here, and we're going to have a great, engaging, informative, empowering discussion. I'm excited, Connie. I think you can take it away.
Sue. I think Sue is going to introduce our very first speaker. We're very excited for this topic on elopement. And Sue?
Yep. So as Pam mentioned, safety is a deeply personal and urgent concern for many families. And our first speaker will be addressing one of the most critical aspects of this elopement and wandering. So Dr. Nathan Call is a leading expert in autism and behavior analysis. He's a professor of pediatrics at Emory University, associate chief of the Division of Autism, and vice president at Marcus Autism Center. And with extensive experience in assessing and treating severe behavior disorders, Dr. Call is committed to expanding access to effective interventions. And today, he will be presenting on ensuring the safety of autistic individuals who elope. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Call.
Thank you, Sue and Connie and Pamela. I'm going to start my slides and go ahead and get started. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here and speak to this group today. I've always had great relationships with the folks at UCLA and the other parts of ARB, and I'm excited to speak on this topic in part because it is such a critically important topic. And I'm going to start out talking about elopement. First, I'm just obligated to recognize some of the funding sources that have supported some of the work that I'm going to be presenting here today, as well as we are about to start a new project that's extension of this work that is also again funded by NICHD. So we're very grateful to these organizations for the work that they do. I want to start out just by talking a little bit about elopement within a context of other forms of dangerous or destructive behavior, and how the research literature has evolved around how to handle some of those other forms of behavior, because it really, I think the latest information or the latest approaches to how elopement is handled or wandering kind of come through that path, but there's also some ways in which that literature has not quite met the need. And so I think it's helpful to see this within that broader context. And so when it comes to addressing lots of different forms of dangerous or destructive behavior, and that this includes things like aggression or self-injury, pica, kids who, I work with kids who sometimes will types of behavior that are causing harm or that are dangerous or destructive. The goal is to start out by trying to individualize those interventions based on the function or the purpose that the behavior serves for that individual. And understanding what the purpose is for them really tells us a lot about how we might best go about addressing it. So sometimes these will be referred to as function-based interventions. Think of these almost as like personalized medicine types approaches that if we understand that this individual is engaging in aggression because they've learned that if they're aggressive, people will provide attention, and this individual might be aggressive because they've learned that if they're aggressive, people will back off and leave them alone, and both of those might be preferred outcomes, but there are very different strategies for how you would go about helping aggression in that case based on the purpose that it serves for those two individuals. And so there's a lot of evidence that function-based interventions are more effective than those that are not when it comes to these behavioral interventions. Now, the issue becomes one of how you go about answering that question of how does one identify the purpose of a particular individual? And there's a process that is called functional assessment by which that happens. And just to give you a brief example of what that can look like, this is an example of a functional analysis. Each one of these little points and the circles and squares and triangles, these represent different observation sessions. Sorry, I'm hearing.
Are you supposed to be sharing the slide?
Yep, is it not showing?
We're not seeing that right now.
Oh, no. Well, it worked earlier. Let me try one more time. How about now? No?
No.
Darn. How about now?
Not seeing it, but I have your slide. So if you can just tell me when to advance to the next slide, I can.
Oh, let's try this. Hold on, one more. Let me try
Okay.
one thing. Let me try one more thing.
All right.
There's no indication that okay, there we go.
Yeah, maybe this is the problem. How about now?
Yes, we see it.
Great. Okay, I apologize for that. Okay, so again, the idea that this is an example then of a functional analysis, and this would be each of these little data points, these squares and circles and triangles, each represent a different 10-minute probe or test condition that is set up to replicate a situation that comes up in the real world where problem behavior like aggression or self-injury or whatever might occur. And so, for example, these ones that are squares with the blue circles around them, these represent a situation that's designed to test what happens when a preferred item might be restricted. So something like a child is playing with an iPad and someone says, like a parent might say, hey, it's time to put that away for just a minute. And if that child becomes aggressive, then we would see whether or not we see more of that aggressive behavior in that situation where the blue circles are presented here compared to this situation where the black circles show up. And that's a situation where the child's just allowed free access to an iPad. And you can see the difference that in this case, for this young man, we saw much more aggressive behavior when someone was saying, hey, I need to take away the iPad than when he had free access to the iPad. That's because the blue circles are higher up, therefore indicating we saw more of that behavior in that particular situation. And so the difference between those two situations tell us a lot about, well, when we try to take iPads away from this young man, we see a lot more aggression than when we don't. And then you can contrast that with other types of situations. So for example, a situation where we might present tasks to perform. So in the two different data paths here, and one of those data paths, the triangles represent an instruction to engage in a task like a homework assignment. And in the other situation, he might be asked to do a self-care task or an adaptive behavior task, tying his shoes. Representing response to when a situation changes in a non-preferred direction and whether or not you see the behavior in that situation. And that tells us a lot about what the purpose of the behavior is for that particular individual. And so this is one important step in understanding how one might go about addressing any kind of problem behavior. I think it's important to remember, though, one of the things that our team here at Marcus Autism Center in Atlanta has really focused on is these are very informative for what we would call a behavioral intervention, right? And when I say behavioral intervention, this is the one that's appearing in green. This means a set of procedures that over time are going to decrease the frequency of the behavior. Usually that's through learning happening. That might be, for example, teaching an alternative approach. So instead of becoming aggressive when an iPad is restricted, teaching the individual to ask appropriately, or wait for a little while, or being able to perform the self-care task more effectively when a demand is presented to do that. And so through these types of learning activities over time, the individual may learn to use those behaviors instead of the dangerous behavior, the aggressive behavior in this case. And that's a really important set of solutions that over time can have a huge impact for that individual and the quality of life for their families, because they're not engaging in the behavior when that situation arises. But it's also only one of 4 different sets of strategies that you're seeing on this slide. And people in the world that I operate within, which is sometimes referred to as behavior analysis, they oftentimes are singularly or solely focused on these behavioral interventions, and they miss the need for some of these other areas that can be equally important. So prevention is a good example, right? Things that you can do to make sure that the situation doesn't come up in the first place. Now, that may not be a strategy to use all the time, but you can avoid a lot of aggression if the kid has the iPad all the time. And that might not be something you want to do forever, but you know what? If you're in a situation where that aggressive behavior isn't tolerable, then prevention strategies like that might be great. Crisis management down at the bottom. Sometimes things get dangerous and you just need to do whatever you need to do to make the situation safe quickly. And so you need to have strategies to manage that, as well as behavior management is a term that we've started to use to talk about mitigating the effects of the behavior when it occurs. So maybe aggression occurs, and how are we going to keep everyone safe so that when aggression occurs, maybe while we're first designing or developing the behavioral intervention, some aggression is going to occur. How do we keep everybody safe? So this is just a broad review of the overall literature on how we can manage any form of challenging, dangerous, destructive type of behavior. And what I wanted to do now is pivot and talk a little bit more about how that approach has been applied to addressing safety concerns around elopement, wandering and running away and leaving supervision. So first of all, when we say elopement, what are we talking about? The truth is it can look really different depending on different individuals. It really just means leaving supervision without permission. And so for some individuals, that might mean just wandering out of the house when someone's busy and not paying attention. It can mean running towards the toy aisle in the store, or the candy aisle, or the snack foods, or whatever. It can also mean just getting out of their seat and wandering away from a classroom when they are supposed to be doing something else, or straying away from a caregiver when they're out at the park. These are all just different examples, but the one thing that they have in common is that this can be a really dangerous and stressful behavior, and that it's much more likely to occur for individuals on the autism spectrum. Here's some data that were published in a paper in Pediatrics, where they showed that kids on the autism spectrum, on average, engaged in elopement. About 40% of them did at some point. More when they were younger than when they were older, but 40% compared to their younger siblings who eloped much less frequently. So this is a much more common situation and hazard for individuals on the autism spectrum. The other thing that this paper did was talk to the families of these individuals to understand how it was affecting them. And it's pretty scary when you think about it. 70% of the families were saying that elopement resulted in a close call with a traffic injury, that it resulted in that it being the most them avoiding activities. So isolation, families not leaving the house for fear of what might happen if their child elopes or runs or wanders away. And I think it's really telling that the first bar here on the left says that most families reported that elopement was the most stressful aspect of their child being on the autism spectrum. In fact, they said more so than really any other fact, the core features of autism were not as stressful as the elopement. This was the #1 source of stress for them. So going back to the slides I was talking about earlier, right? The functional analysis and how one might go about actually trying to understand the purpose of elopement for a child who elopes. Well, thinking about how these conditions were set up before, thinking of that tangible condition when the iPad is being restricted, right? So a child, in a theoretical version of this, a child would have access to a preferred item. Someone might say it's time to take that away. And if the child elopes, then they should get access to that for another brief period. Usually it's about 30 seconds. And then any other behavior that comes along, the therapist might ignore. And you'd contrast that with a situation where a child would have free access to the iPad in that particular example. And then to test out the theory about whether or not the behavior is related to avoiding or escaping from non-preferred demands, you might present the child with the task. It's time to, fold some laundry or do your homework or what have you. And if elopement occurs, you'd say, never mind, you can have a break for about 30 seconds, and then you would ignore other behavior. And all of that would be contrasted with a condition or situation where they have continuous access to iPads, no demands are being presented, and so on. So theoretically, this should be possible, right? That you would just replace aggression or a self-injury or what other behavior you might be assessing in a functional analysis with elopement, and you should be able to use that same methodology to figure out the purpose of elopement for an individual child, and based on that, develop strategies for how you would handle it. But there's some particular issues about elopement that make this a little bit trickier than that. First of all, there's just the safety concern of allowing elopement to occur. We can't go to a park and say, all right, we're doing a functional analysis now, so I'm going to take Johnny's iPad away, and if he runs away, I'm going to give it back. Well, if he runs away, he might go into the street, he might be in a dangerous situation. You just can't let that happen, of course. So that's a big concern. Another issue is that there's some confounding variables of anytime elopement occurs, you kind of have to go back to the situation you were in before. So you say, I'm going to take away the iPad for just a minute, Johnny, and Johnny runs away. Now I have to go get Johnny to save him from running into the street and keep him safe. And that introduces a whole other set of variables. Now I'm providing attention, which is not something that we were specifically testing for. And we're also introducing physically maybe holding his hand. We're introducing the fact that I look really funny when I chase kids and kids think that's hilarious. And so these are all different factors that kind of confound and muddy up the picture and make it harder to interpret results of a functional analysis if you're testing elopement in that kind of a situation. And then the last thing is, again, maybe for safety reasons or in order to kind of get back under the situation that you started in, oftentimes that requires kind of physically blocking the child from leaving a room or moving a child back to another situation. And that in and of itself, we don't like to physically, interfere with a child in any way, but also some of the time these individuals are bigger than I am, and that becomes a real challenge. So there's just some of these impediments to being able to do this work. So really back in the 90s, some folks in the behavior analysis literature published a paper. This was Kathleen Piazza and colleagues were the first to really do this. And it has since really led to a methodology that's become, within a small group of people who work in this world, relatively understood and relatively common. And the way that this is set up is essentially have two different rooms where you have different sets of situations set up. So you kind of have, in this case, a room A and a room B. And here at our center, we actually have a special space that was built just to assess elopement, where we have a hallway that connects room A and room B. And so a child can only go from A to B and really can't go anywhere else. And so in this situation, if we were going to test for that idea of, is elopement occurring because of restricted access or to gain access to things like preferred items like iPads, we might start out in room A, where the child has the iPad. And then a therapist comes over and says, we're going to go over to this other room over here. Let's go and leave the iPad behind, right? And if that happens, then the child no longer has access to the iPad because they're in room B. If that kid runs back to room A, they get the iPad briefly, and we say, all right, never mind, you can have it for a second. And then that resets the situation and we do it again, right? And that allows us to kind of test out how often are we seeing elopement every time we might remove access to a preferred item like an iPad. I'm using iPad because everybody likes iPads these days, but it can be anything, right? It can be preferred snacks or activities or anything like that. We had a child we had one of the trickiest groups of kids I ever worked with. We had twin brothers who would both elope. And whenever they went to the store, one kid would elope towards, he always really liked kind of big industrial style equipment. So he would go over to the deli counter to see the slicers. And the other brother would run towards the balloons. And mom was always kind of stuck with this choice of which kid do I chase, right? And these kids were not particularly, they didn't speak much. And so, but you could tell that they kind of had a system worked out where I go left, you go right. She can't get us both, man. And they were very effective at creating havoc for their mom. And if we have time, I can talk more about some of the things that we saw with those young men. Now, again, to test that same thing out in a situation where we're testing for escaping from a non-preferred activity. Well, in room A, child can choose their preferred activity, and then the therapist presents an instruction. It's time to do some homework, for example. And if the child runs to the other side, runs to room B, then they get a break for a little while. And then within room B, therapist comes back and says it's time to do the demand again. And we see, do they run? And again, how often are they eloping from one setting to another setting? This situation, as you can see, it kind of controls for those confounding variables, keeps everybody safe. We don't have to restrain or move the child necessarily. And so it gives us an opportunity to do the same kind of assessment for elopement that we might do for any other type of behavior. And so from here, then it becomes a matter of how do we figure out what those interventions can look like. And for a lot of kids, the first thing we want to do is to, once we've identified the purpose or the function of the behavior, choosing an alternative behavior that can replace elopement. So an individual who elopes in order to get attention, for example, we might focus on teaching a skill like staying within arm's reach. We had a young man that we saw a while back who was he would elope towards balloons. This was a second child who would elope to balloons, not the twin brother of the other young man, but he would elope to balloons and he loved to pop balloons and he was really good at it. And we were at our building where our facility is located. His mom was bringing him in for the very first appointment to work on elopement, and the rental property across the street had some balloons out front, and it kind of had a sign that said new leases available. And he got away from mom, even though she had 3 other people with her. She kind of would always, anytime she took him in public, it was like the Secret Service. They kind of surrounded him, and he still got loose, and he got out, and he was running across the street to get to those balloons, and he was hit by a car. And he's okay. And his mom was actually remarkably chill about the whole thing. This was his 4th time being hit by a car, and she said if the 3rd one didn't get him, the 4th one was probably going to be all right. So that level of danger and hazard for a young man who could run, but for him being able to teach him to stay within arm's reach, so that he would always be with mom. And we actually had mom carrying in her purse all of these little balloons. And if he would ask appropriately, he could have the balloon, he'd inflate it, and he'd pop it. And he learned pretty quickly to stay with mom. And then over time, faded out the presence of those balloons. So he had to go longer and longer before he could ask. And eventually we had the final exam for him. And we took him to the mall in Atlanta on Valentine's Day when it was full of balloons everywhere. And he stayed right next to mom, and they walked up and down the mall while they were able to do that. And he could tolerate 15 minutes without having a balloon from mom, without running towards the balloons that he would see around him. So that's an example of how you might handle something like a tangible function or engaging in elopement that's maintained by accessing items and activities that are preferred. For behavior that's more escape maintained, so to avoid or get away from things that are not preferred. If it's a task, completing a small portion of that task initially and then gradually working your way up, staying in task, tolerating a thing that might not be preferred. We see a lot of kids who might elope because there's some stimulation in the environment that's really non-preferred. There was a young one we saw who anytime there was a loud noise, she would get up and run. And so again, teaching her to initially tolerate really quiet noises and then very gradually increasing the volume while she stayed seated without necessarily running out of her school. And then for her final exam, we did 3 fire drills in the same day. And she did great, and she was able to tolerate that, but it took a lot of time and teaching that replacement behavior to be able to tolerate that over time. And keeping in mind that, again, that in some cases, leaving supervision is appropriate and teaching how to just differentiate between when is it okay and when is it not. And so some things that we've done, for example, is teaching kids to check in. So being in the background alone is okay, but you need to check in every 5 minutes. And if you check in every 5 minutes, initially there's some reinforcer that's available for that kid. And over time, that might fade out to where they have to go for hours at a time, as long as they're checking in every 5 minutes so that the caregivers know that they're still safe. And again, what we talk with families a lot is once we establish these interventions, it's important to practice these in settings where they're not as naturalistic. So the example of going to the mall where there's lots of balloons, fire drills, doing this in initially practicing in controlled situations, but then over time moving into situations that are not as well controlled. But in those controlled situations, you have the opportunity to practice to teach those skills and make sure that they're having the desired effect, and then gradually increasing the requirements for that individual. So this approach to addressing elopement within this behavioral intervention approach, right? So identifying function, teaching replacements, and so forth. There's a study by Lang and colleagues where they did a review. So most of these early studies had very few participants in them. And 3, 4, 5 participants early on. Lang and colleagues in 2009 did a meta-analysis where they looked at all of the different studies that tested out this approach in one way or another. And overall, across 10 studies, 53 participants, they found that for the most part, people were seeing pretty good outcomes, that about 80% reported there was a positive result for those kids. None reported that there were bad results, and a few kind of said it was a mixed result. Now, there's a real problem with studies like this that kind of pull from published data sets. And the problem there is it's really hard to publish results, right? Going to journal reviewers and saying, hey, we want to tell everybody about how we tried this thing and it doesn't work. Turns out, reviewers and editors don't necessarily like publishing that very often. And so the question becomes one of, even though we see here from these data that this approach can work, the question is how probable is that type of an outcome? Because it could be that for every kid that somebody tried something like this and got it published with a positive result, someone else tried and it failed, but we just don't know because there weren't those same opportunities to publish negative findings. And so some colleagues and I published a subsequent study where we looked at every kid who came to our center over about a 3-year period for the treatment of elopement. This was a paper we published back in 2017. And every kid, when they came to see us, whether the results were good, bad, or kind of in the middle, and look at the results for those individuals. And what we found was about half, a little more than half of the individuals, we saw a 90% improvement in elopement using this same type of an approach. And, 100% of the kids at least got to a 50% improvement. So again, suggesting that this is an approach that has a lot of promise and can be pretty effective, and some early evidence that this can produce effects that are positive, even at a larger scale than had been done before. So positive signs. Now, all that being said, there's still some pretty significant issues here, right? So remember when I talked about how each of these different pieces of a treatment plan are critically important, and this literature has focused almost exclusively on this middle column of behavioral interventions, right? So we're kind of making good progress on developing these behavioral interventions. How do you do a functional assessment of elopement? How do you develop function-based treatments for elopement? There's a lot that's been done in this domain, and that's all really positive, and we're happy that this is making progress. But these other 3 areas are just as important. And unfortunately, at least in the discipline that I work, there hasn't been nearly as much attention paid to some of these other issues. So again, this idea of prevention, how do you make sure that the kid doesn't even attempt to elope in the first place so that you don't have to deal with it? How can you prevent elopement attempts in the first place? How do you mitigate the effects of elopement? So when a child does elope, how do we make sure that they're still going to be safe and that you can retrieve them safely and find them and all of those kinds of issues? What about crisis management? When things really do hit the fan and the child's missing, how do you go about making sure that the child is going to be safe and you do whatever you can to minimize harm? These are all very real issues that families deal with, and there hasn't been the same level of at least research on some of these other issues. And again, even within the clinical programs that develop these behavioral interventions for elopement, they tend to only focus on the behavioral intervention. And so our center and some colleagues and I have really tried to put together, how do we package all of the different pieces? And the good news is there's a lot of work that has happened in some of these other areas. It's just that they haven't always been packaged together or presented to families. When they're getting one of these things, they're not necessarily getting access to the others. And so some examples of things like prevention. So of course, there's physical prevention, putting door locks, or the little child-proofing the door so that the thing spins in their hands, putting up fencing around the yard, harnesses. I've had people ask me before, is that okay or not? One of the things that we've done is we've developed a transportation safety program where families can come here and they can get fitted for a harness that will latch into a special car seat so that kids are safe in the car. Because we've had a lot of instances of kids who, when the car is at a stop sign, jump out, maybe they're able to get out of the car one way or the other, and it's not safe for them, or they become dangerous in other ways in the car, and the families can't transport them. Again, huge impact on families' quality of life and just the isolation that they sometimes will experience because they're afraid to leave or take their child somewhere. So these would all just be examples of how you can prevent elopement from occurring in the first place. So really helpful in that respect. And then with respect to mitigation, so how do you diminish the potential for harm should elopement occur? So we really, the number one thing that we recommend is teaching water safety, swimming and water safety. If you look at the elopement data, where there are really bad outcomes, scary outcomes, it's usually that the individual falls into a body of water and can drown, and the drowning risk is probably one of the most dangerous parts of elopement. And so that's one of the things that we encourage families to do, regardless of whether their child elopes or not, because elopement is unfortunately one of those things where a single instance of that behavior has the potential for a really bad outcome, as very dangerous. And so that's something that every child we encourage to be working on. But other things like just crossing the street safely, looking both ways. How do you cross the street safely so that if the child is away from the family, they're at least as safe as possible? Identifying a community helper, who's someone that you can approach and ask for help. Having identifiable information on the individual. And so we've seen like lots of things like bracelets, temporary tattoos, tags in clothing, stuff like that, all of which can be really important and helpful when it comes to just mitigating the risk of elopement should it occur. And then lastly, crisis response and readiness. And so our team, again, has done a lot of work around how we can make this situation safe again as quickly as you possibly can. So you can see on the right some of the worksheets that we use when we work with families. We have a elopement prevention safety plan, and it includes things like helping families become more familiar with what happens when they call first responders. We actually have them go through a role play with someone who is, a part of from their local precinct, so that they understand when they call, what's the right information? How do they have that child's information readily accessible, a recent photo, all of that, so that if they need to call first responders, they have that information close at hand, readily accessible, and they know what they're going to expect when they have that conversation with first responders. We ask families to prioritize search areas, look around their neighborhood, and the first priority is the riskiest place. So if you do live near a body of water, that's the first place to search. But after that, knowing this is a child who consistently, when they elope, they always go to the playground. Or there's a young man that we worked with who he would always elope towards the airport. He lived like 5 miles from the airport, but he knew it was kind of southwest. And he always said he wanted to go to the airport to invite the whole world to a party that he was throwing. And so that was his understanding of how one went about doing that. And so he would elope to the airport. Or another young woman who had moved from her house when she was about 12, and she would continuously try to get out of the house and go back to her original home, which was about 1.5 miles away. So, knowing that that's where she's going, that's really helpful, but you don't always know. And so making sure you first search those high danger areas, and then afterwards, if there's somewhere specific, and then after that, identifying how to search other areas, how you develop a search pattern, how do you form a search team? One of the things we ask families to do is to talk to their neighbors so that they understand given kind of the culture and where we are these days, lots of people get really nervous about approaching strangers or someone else's kid. And so telling your neighbors, if you see my kid walking out in the street alone, they're not supposed to be there. Please stop them. Here's how you can contact me if that happens. And oh, by the way, if my child who's on the autism spectrum elopes, would you be willing for me to knock on your door to help us search for my son or my daughter, right? Like those types of conversations with neighbors can be crucially important. So how one might go about setting up those types of search committees and designing those in advance, so that when the moment happens, that really scary moment when that individual is missing, this isn't something that you haven't at first already thought through. So again, just another example of some of the work that I think is not always included in some of the other behavior intervention type clinical programs and so forth. And so all of this is something that I think is important. This is work that our team has developed an actual manualized intervention. We call it the function-based elopement treatment that incorporates all of these different elements. And the idea here is that we have a center here where we've done a lot of work on this topic, and we have specialized clinical services that do nothing but treat elopement as much as we possibly can. Unfortunately, we aren't able to see as many kids and families as we want. So we know that the only way for this to really have the impact that we know it needs to have is for us not to be the place in our community doing it, or the only place that we can't. Not every family can come to our center. So the goal is for people to be able to provide comparable services. You shouldn't have to come to Marcus Autism Center in Atlanta, Georgia to get this kind of support. And so this is a manual that we've developed now that can be handed off to. We always just say the idea is to hand it off to someone like a mediocre BCBA. Nobody on this call, and certainly nobody that you know, but let's be honest, we all know those folks are out there. And so if those individuals who maybe don't have this kind of training, my experience has been that there's a lot of really great BCBAs out in the world, but this isn't something that they necessarily got training in when they were first starting to do this work. And so this manual will walk them through step by step how to conduct a functional assessment of elopement. It'll walk them through how to set up a safety plan for that child, what a crisis management strategy should look like, talking through how the family can do prevention and what those strategies can look like, and making sure that families can get the same kinds of outcomes, whether they come to a center that's specialized like ours, or they're able to access this in their community. So this is early work. This is work that, again, was funded through NIH as well as Autism Speaks. We've completed our initial randomized controlled trial showing that we got really good outcomes when it was implemented by some community BCBAs. And so we're excited to start to see this work hopefully come to more and more communities as a result of some of this initial work. And so that is what I have for you. I know I rushed through some things, and I apologize if that's the case, but I know there's an interest in having some time for questions, so I wanted to make sure we save some time. I hope that's okay.
Yeah, that was perfect pacing. Thank you, Dr. Cole. So we do have a few questions in the Q&A. So Wendy asks, uh, so I have 3 sons. 2 of them have a diagnosis of autism, and the youngest not yet officially diagnosed yet. I find it difficult to try to modify their behaviors individually because sometimes what the older sibling does, the other 2 will do. Is it wrong to try to use the same method to try to change the behavior?
So let me use that example of the 2 brothers, right? So we had these were twin brothers, and one would elope towards one thing and one would elope towards another. For those 2 young men, the same overarching framework of how we approached elopement was in place for both of them. But we absolutely had to tailor that approach to each of them, because one young man would elope towards, like I said, I think the deli slicer behind the counter, and the other would elope towards the balloons, right? And so they were eloping for different reasons in those cases, which meant we had to have different strategies. Now, because both kids eloped, we actually came up with a system. And so over time, what we taught them was that we had a system of, it was just little laminated cards, right? And so when the blue card was out, one of the brothers got to choose what they got to go do, and they would choose to go and look at the slicer, right? And when the green card was out, the other brother got to go choose what they would do, and they would go look at balloons. And when the red card was out, mom was in charge, and mom got to decide what they would do. And so one of the things that would always happen is if they would elope, it would always go to the first thing would happen. We taught those boys that if your brother runs away, you sit down and stay where you are so that mom can go retrieve your sibling and come back and know you're still going to be there, right? So that was a skill that was really important to teach. The other thing that would happen though is if one brother ran, both of them would go, it would always go to the red card, and mom was in charge as a result of that. And so one of the things that we saw was for their final exam, we actually went to the county fair, and just think about it, right? Lots of big industrial rides and equipment and stuff like that, as well as lots of balloons. And one of the things that we started to see was these boys were lined up. The brother with the blue card was in line first, and he was going to go get to look at some of the rides. They were waiting in line, and the other brother started to hold him by the collar. And we thought that was kind of weird. But what we realized was he had learned, basically, again, he couldn't vocalize this, but he had learned, look, man, don't run, because if you run, we both lose. And so he was kind of holding his brother in place to keep him from running away, because he wanted to make sure that they got to do the thing that they preferred. So I guess in answer to Wendy's question, the overall framework, every treatment plan needs all 4 of those domains: prevention, behavioral intervention, mitigation, crisis management, but they're all going to look really different for each of those kids. So my recommendation would be to make sure you're including those. Some might be emphasized more than another, and the function might be different for each of those young men or each of your sons, it sounds like. But that same framework can be really, really effective. And our goal is that there can be more and more people in the community over time who know how to support families like yours to build out that treatment plan so that you can actually get the kind of help that you need to really work on some of those pieces that might not be as intuitive. I think a lot of families are usually pretty good at prevention, right? I just never take his iPad away, and we never have to deal with it. But that's not realistic. And that's the problem with prevention strategies, is that they're great until they're not. But that's one that you don't necessarily need a professional to help you with as much as maybe a behavioral intervention. But some of these other pieces, and there are access to things like tools like the Big Red Box, or there's other tools. The Autism Speaks has an elopement packet that families can access that is also really good. And so those types of tools are available for some of those other pieces, like the mitigation strategies and the crisis management. So I tend to be long-winded, and I apologize to Wendy and everyone else, but I hope an answer was in there somewhere.
Yeah, that was great. The next question is by Meg. Is there anything parents can do preemptively with first responders? What can parents do to become familiar with what happens when you contact first responders?
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually something that our team did a little bit of work on a while back. So, and this is slightly different than just elopement, but we see kids with all forms of dangerous and destructive behavior, and sometimes that behavior is aggression or self-injury or property destruction and so on. And we're here in Atlanta, and we serve lots of different families of different backgrounds, and we've had lots of instances where calling first responders, it feels like a risky thing to do in and of itself, right? So we've got examples of where a child is in the front yard throwing things or breaking things or screaming, and first responders are called. and the cops roll up, and we've had examples of where a child has been tased or a family member is put in handcuffs. And it's, in some ways what ends up happening is that calling first responders escalates rather than de-escalates the situation. And so we did, we kind of wanted to have a response to that, and we did a lot of work thinking about how might we do training for first responders. And then we took a step back. There's one of the only good ideas I've ever had in my life. And we said, let's take a step back and let's talk to everybody involved. And we did some focus groups with the families, and we did some interviews with the first responders. And the families kind of said, especially those who lived in parts of town, maybe where, in the suburbs, you might get one response, but you live in another part of Atlanta. And certainly people from like minority backgrounds had a different experience with first responders in ways that it was really, in some cases, again, felt risky, right? And then we talked to the first responders themselves, and they were very candid with us. And they said, look, as police officers, for example, we do everything. We do traffic stops, we do well checks, we do mental health stuff, we do everything under the sun. You can come and you can train us, and we'll listen attentively, and we'll even try our best to incorporate what you tell us. But the truth is, 6 weeks, 6 months from then, it's going to be really hard to maintain some of the stuff that gets trained. And so what we ended up doing instead was working with the families on how they could be as prepared as possible, so that if they need to call first responders, they knew how to de-escalate the cops, basically, right? And so we had a process where we had those families talk to, identify, do a practice run of a call to 911, and who picks up the phone and what happens and what information to give them. And then if police show up, how might you provide information as concisely as possible, the information that they actually need, and help to make the situation safe as quickly as possible. And then we actually did role plays, and our local precinct volunteered to participate. And we went out in our parking lot here at our center, and families practiced, and the cops drove up with their lights on, and the families got to rehearse the whole thing. And that seemed to make a real difference. The other thing that made a real difference that I'll say in this respect was, again, talking to your neighbors. Because most of the time in those kinds of situations, at least, maybe not so much for elopement, it isn't necessarily the families who call 911. It's the people across the street or in your building who hear the noise or get concerned that something's going on that's dangerous, and they will be the ones that call 911. So again, those conversations with the members of your community about, all right, here's what help looks like for us, right? This is the situation that could arise. Here's what help looks like for us. That actually, and again, people oftentimes are trying to be helpful. They just don't know what being helpful really means for a family that's dealing with a crisis situation, like a child who's eloped or who's in the front yard throwing things. So I did it again. My wife tells people, sometimes you put a quarter in me and you got to listen to the whole song. That's a reference for you younger folks to like jukeboxes. It was a thing back in the day. But I apologize that I tend to be so long-winded on answering questions.
Oh, that was great. Thank you. I think some people are interested in the elopement treatment manual. Is this something that families can access?
So we just are about to get, we've submitted another grant to NIH for this work. It scored very well. We're excited to start a new study that is going to hopefully continue to refine that. I need to, one of the things I'm doing is working with my colleagues about when it's ready to make it accessible to providers. And so, we want to talk about what's the best way to disseminate this as effectively as possible. And this is work that I initially started, and then about 4 years ago, turned it over to a junior colleague who really has done a ton of work afterwards. And I always want to be really careful about not taking some of her work and doing anything without checking with her first. And so I can't commit to like sharing with everyone on this call necessarily, but our hope is that they'll be accessible very soon.
I think we'll do one last question. So what would be the best thing to do for our child while they're eloping out in the community?
Well, again, if you're in the community and your child is eloping, the number one thing is to make the situation safe as quickly as possible, right? I mean, I think if that's the question, and I'm not sure that's quite what they were asking, but if you're in a situation where a child is eloped, forget all the other strategies about like, oh, I don't want to reinforce bad behavior or reward bad behavior, any of that kind of stuff. Like that's where you're in that crisis management situation. Get it under control as quickly as possible. The problem is that oftentimes the way you do that is to do the opposite of what is going to produce the desired long-term effect, right? So that child who I take the iPad away and then he runs and he's going towards traffic and I say, never mind, you can have the iPad here, please, quick, stop. That'll get him to stop. That'll get him to calm down or come back because I'm providing him with access to the iPad. But from a long-term perspective, I've just taught him one more time, one more example of how eloping actually is a pretty good way to get the things you want in life, right? And so that can actually make things worse in the long term. So I'm not one of these people who's going to say never ever do that. If he's eloping towards traffic, do what you got to do, right? Make the situation safe. That's the priority number one. But if all you ever do is that, then you are actually making things more dangerous over the long run, which is why all four elements of that treatment strategy are important. It's important to have that behavioral intervention in place so that over the long run, he's learning how to tolerate periods of non-access to the iPad or whatever it is that function might be. So the two things really have to both be in place. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Dr. Cole, since your email address is on the slide, it would be okay if people.
Oh, of course, happy to share. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but if you have remaining questions, please email Dr. Call. His email address is up here on the slide. And also everyone who's presenting today is a great resource. So if your family is struggling with safety related issues, please feel free to connect with us or our speakers. So thank you so much, Dr. Call, for sharing the research-based strategies for elopement and for addressing our audience questions.
It's absolutely my pleasure. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to work with what a tremendous group of folks, and I wish everybody the best, and please let me know how else I can be helpful.
Thank you so much. All right, so now we're going to move into our panel discussion where our community experts will explore safety topics affecting autistic individuals and their families. And for this session, Dr. Kazri will be moderating the conversation. So let me turn it over to Dr. Kazri and our panelists.
Great. Thank you. Well, that was great information from Nathan. And really, he is the preeminent expert on this in the country. So as he said, he's in Atlanta, but he's a great clinical resource for, I think, providers as well as families. So we're really honored to have had him here today. But now we're going to kind of shift to thinking about community-based experts and supports. And so we have a very experienced lineup of community members and professionals who are going to address specific issues of safety for our youth. And I'm going to introduce each of them, and then we'll ask some questions to sort of get us going. I think it's helpful to just let everybody know who we have on the panel, and that way they may have questions for each other, or we may overlap in questions. So first we have Kelly Kruger, who's a licensed psychologist and board-certified behavior analyst. She has over 18 years of experience working with neurodivergent populations. We know her well. She did her PhD with us at UCLA. She's the Senior Clinical Director of Neurodevelopmental Services, Southern California region for Pacific Clinics and the Center for Divergent Connections. And she's going to be talking specifically about mental health safety. And then next we have Erin Wilson, who, along with her husband, created If I Need Help. It's an ID system to track children if they get lost. So really following on Nathan Call's presentation. And this was really inspired by her son, Jay. So she has very lived experience with this issue. And she's going to be talking about wandering and elopement. And then Kimberly Lavalantet is a board-certified behavior analyst and founder of Behaviorum, I probably said that wrong, Health Services, where she provides both behavioral and sexual health awareness and education for every learner and their family. So that's another very important issue in terms of talking about internet and online safety. So let's see if we can, there we are. Okay, let's get started with some questions. So for Kelly, I think mental health issues are pretty common for autistic youth. And we always want to intervene as early as possible. But of course, mental health is still kind of in the shadows a lot of times and difficult when your child also has autism. But we want to avert having a hospitalization. So what are the most common early signs that you see or that parents report? And what should they do? Who should they reach out to?
So I would say, there is a lot of the traditional trademark depressive symptoms that you might notice. a depressed mood, loss of pleasure in activities, feeling hopeless, changes in appetite, whether it's increased or decreased, having sleep problems, poor concentration. But when we really think about depression and anxiety and autism, we see some really that may be more specific to autism, some of these symptoms. So when we think about people's special interests or circumscribed interests, you may see folks who have they are finding less pleasure in the things that they're really used to enjoy. Or you might see a really increased intensity, a marked increased intensity in some of those interests. We may also see increased repetitive behaviors, increased insistence on sameness or routines, increases in self-injury or aggression, and declines in self-care, regressive behaviors. So those are some of the things that are more specific. And we know that a lot of autistic folks experience alexithymia or difficulty identifying and expressing their emotions. So some autistic children and teens may really struggle to recognize those feelings of depression or anxiety. So, there's a couple places to go from there as you're seeing it. One of the default referrals that you get when you're a parent of an autistic child and you go to your pediatrician, they typically just tell you to, check out ABA. And that's not always the most helpful thing. So looking for early, mental health providers that are comfortable working with autistic folks and those with developmental disabilities, really coming from a trauma-informed perspective. Play therapy is another really good avenue where it doesn't really rely on as much of the language and processing, but it really can allow the autistic child or teen to participate in more expressive therapies. So I would say starting there for those early signs of mental health issues.
Right. So your center or places that have autism centers like at UCLA, our CAN clinic deals with individuals with autism who also have co-occurring mental health issues. So you want to look for somebody who's actually experienced.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, we see a lot of families who get referrals from their health insurance and they just go to whoever is the first provider in network. And most of the time, they're really not equipped or trained to help support some of the nuances of folks with developmental disabilities and autism and some of the specific, communication differences or sensory processing differences. And so it's terrible when you have families feel like mental health therapy or counseling isn't helpful, because it can be. You just sort of have to find providers with the right training and experience.
Yeah. So, and if somebody sort of contacted you and you're out of their area, you probably know other people that are experienced that you could recommend, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. If you all have questions specifically for any of our panelists too, please post those in the Q&A. So we'll get to those if we can. Okay, so for Erin, let's see, what do I have for you? So, I mean, your sort of expertise really follows on what Nathan Call talked about. He was talking about elopement and wandering and very specific tools. And you have a very personal reason for why you developed your ID system. So maybe you could just tell us about that and talk about your son a little bit.
Actually, I don't know if you remember me. My son was in your play program years ago. He was your very first person, Jay, when he was 7, and he's 23 now.
Oh, absolutely.
You remember me now?
Absolutely. Oh, that's
yeah. We called him Jumping Jay. He was always active, and you could hear us before we even got to the room. He was running down the hallways. So
Helen probably worked with him.
yeah, I thought that was you. I knew
Yeah.
your name.
That's me.
Great.
Yeah, so he's 23 now and he was 7
Wow.
then.
Wow.
Yeah. So, as you know, he was so active, had so much energy, and he was lost at a few places. And one was at school, and so my husband and I were like, well, what can we do that people would know that he's someone who needs help, and then how to help him. And so we started having wearable QR codes that link to the person's profile. And so we've been doing this for a while. We're with just about every regional center throughout the state for safety ID kits. So we have shoe tags, bracelets, ID cards. We have over 80 different products. And it's a free membership on our site. And we have people internationally too. We have over 40,000 members now. And so they can come and get a free membership on If I Need Help. And then they can create a profile. They can print out their own QR code and use it however they want. And we also have the emergency Q&A where they can go in and answer what an officer would ask during critical missing. And so, like, when you leave the house, do you go left or right? Can they swim? Where would they go? Where would they not go? Because, during that crisis, we're all way too upset to process that and know the accurate answers. So when you're nice and calm, you can fill it in and then print it out and keep it in your purse, car, or house to show a first responder, or you can email it from the website. But we've had great success stories with people wearing our IDs. And, Jay has sensory issues, so we have patches on all his shirts that have the QR codes on it. Yeah.
This is amazing. I often think about working with schools and how they have issues with elopement and wandering, and so they usually put a one-on-one aid on the child, but that's not always effective because sometimes, people aren't paying that close of attention. So I think having a QR code or something to, find children would be amazing. And I don't know how many schools have adopted this, but it would seem to be a great solution.
Yeah, we've had some school districts throughout the country and fire departments and police stations, give it like the New York sheriffs were giving it to people in their community to wear. And, they wear or carry it. And we have people of all different levels of sensory needs and verbal, or if they want it to be more discreet, or, we've talked to hundreds of families now to try to, come up with solutions for them. Mhm.
Right. And so one of our participants is asking about the web address. I think it's on the information, the resources. Is that right? Right?
It's called ifineedhelp.org. Ifineedhelp.org. So like I said, you can just go to that and do the free sign up and create your profile and print out your own code and use the emergency Q&A. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, let me move on to Kimberly, and that way we can come back around, and people may have questions for you as well. So Kimberly, online interactions are so common. I mean, social media with our new generation of young people is just really kind of normative. And, so our kids also want to be part of that community. But how does a parent sort of address that conversation about internet safety, online behavior, especially around like dating and those kinds of issues when your child has autism?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think, as you mentioned, right, given that online access is just so accessible for everyone and it's just so easy, and everyone can just easily pick up a phone and get online and check on websites and be in right of it all. And so how do we safeguard everyone? And I think that's the most important aspect. Knowing that the access is there, but ensuring that we have prior discussions ahead of time with everyone's sons and daughters as far as what's realistic when it comes to getting online. Right. And so I think one important thing that we all want to focus on is for all caregivers to talk about the fact that everything online is public, right? Like when we're teaching skills about what is public and private, this is a skill that we want to be working on as just a general aspect to have that understanding. But then it also translates onto online activity, right? And realizing that everything online is public. And so that once we share anything, it will be there forever. Even if we delete it on our end, whatever social media or posting site we might be on, someone may have already saved it or copied it and could spread it. So we want to make sure that we're able to, as best as possible, explain that to your sons and daughters so that, again, we can understand that photos, messages, anything we might say online can be there forever. And I think another really good rule when it comes to that aspect of permanency is when we're talking about what do we post, right? Always having this kind of rule that I've worked on in past with past individuals is it okay for your grandma to see this? Would it be okay if mom and dad saw this post and this picture? If your teacher saw this post, would it be okay? Would you not be embarrassed or have any shame associated with it? What if your boss saw this post? Right? So I think when we start having those conversations and we identify key people and key categories of our social relationships, I think having that rule of would it be okay if mom, grandma, dad, or my boss saw this is a nice way to make a differentiation of do I post or not, right? When we're talking about them. You also mentioned, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Keep going.
You mentioned, what do we teach about online dating, right? This is also something extremely popular. When we're talking about how do you meet someone that you're interested in romantically, the common thing these days is to go online and make a connection with someone. And so that also is applying to young individuals. And we want to be able to support, your sons and daughters who are ready to date, to get out there and to make connections with other people. And when it comes to that, one important aspect is having a conversation ahead of time, right? Before they create their profile, sitting down and talking about what is online dating in the first place. We want to explain that everyone online is not who they say they are, right? Regardless of, again, what platform you're on. We also want to talk about how does online dating work and talk about the different types of apps that are out there, the different platforms, and the reputation that are associated with different apps. We also want to discuss the importance of being clear and honest on your behalf and forthcoming, and also discussing if you're going to divulge your diagnosis in your profile as well. Some people may want to do that, some may not. And so I think that comes with, being honest and forthcoming as far as who you are as a person, to then being able to connect with people who have common interests with you. We also want to talk about that just because you send a message to someone doesn't mean that they're going to respond. So again, with online dating, we want to touch upon the aspect of rejection, that it's likely to happen, that we all experience it in some form or another. And also, if there's any type of harassment of any kind, we want to be aware of that as well, so that your son or daughter knows that they can come to you to have these conversations about what their exchanges are looking like. So I think most importantly, and I think this just applies to all general online use, is you as a caregiver being that source of safety, having open conversations so that your son or daughter can come to you if they notice any red flags, any type of disrespect or bullying or harassment, so that we can then address it and decide what steps to take next.
Yeah, we have actually, this probably relates to all of you, but there's one question from Angela where she's talking about making a plan at school because of certain behaviors. Her child, who's autistic, is being labeled as a bully, even though he isn't. However, due to his behavior in the school environment, he's being wrongly labeled as a bully. He's in regular classes, and she's wanting to know what to do. And we've had similar situations in some of our research participants. We had a young high schooler who would follow his so-called friends at lunchtime because they could go off campus, and he was smoking pot during lunchtime. And this was even before it was legal. So there was the legality part, but also he's getting high at lunchtime. So it's this substance use. And I know, Kelly, you deal with this with some of your clients, but also just this sort of issue about knowing who's a friend, who's not a friend, the bullying issue. And when it's at school, so why do we know that it's happening at school? Because the children are telling their parents because they're very honest, right? But what do you do about that? So I don't know if any of you want to answer this.
I'd be happy to jump in. I think that this is really it speaks to a larger systemic issue, which is so often we put the onus on the autistic or developmentally disabled child to change their behavior, which is really not a bullying behavior or aggressive behavior or any of these things, rather than educating the folks around them to say, like, okay, just because you speak directly, you don't sugarcoat things, that doesn't make you rude or mean. Just because I act this way doesn't actually mean that. Might be your neurotypical interpretation of it, but that's not actually what's happening. So I think oftentimes doing some just general like education to class it, and you can do it so easily in classrooms when kids are young, just talking about different cultures, different there's an autistic culture, and these are the kind of the things that are part of our autistic culture, and it doesn't make us X, Y, or Z. This is just some of the things you might see with autistic kids in your class. And it's funny, I did a mental health wellness fair at a high school recently, and we were talking about autism, and I asked how many people sort of knew about it. And when I used to do these, nobody would raise their hand, and like there were 2 autistic kids in the classroom, and they're like, I'm autistic. And everybody's around like, yeah, we all know about this now. So I think there's just growing awareness in society, but just starting when the kids are young, talking to them about what some of this stuff can look like, and really taking the heat off of the autistic child to have to make all of these changes and mask their behavior to fit into classes. And then we know that masking has significant long-term detrimental impacts to autistic people's mental health. So I think it's really kind of a systemic problem that we can start by just educating kids and teachers.
If they're open to it. I mean, that's
if they're open to it, right?
Right. But, also, I think, Kimberly, you were talking about sort of dating and trying to understand who's real and who's not, who's my friend, who's not my friend. And it's hard. I mean, it's hard for everybody, but it's particularly hard for our youth. So I don't know if you have some, I don't know, suggestions on how to keep them safe.
Yes, and I think this comes back to like our social skill awareness, right? And so when we're looking at creating these opportunities for online, again, pre-planning ahead of time, setting some rules ahead of time, right? And some boundaries around online use. It might require caregivers to also supervise ahead of time what their internet interactions look like. And also when it comes to, talking about who people really are on the other side of the screen, we might have to role play some conversations and what that looks like. And so role play, we know that can be an effective way to develop social skills. And so we want to take those tools and apply them here and create different scenarios. Another way as well that we can still mimic the role play is to maybe even send text messages to your child, right? That could be socially inappropriate, bullying like, phishing or scam like. Let's see, what does your child respond, right? Again, we want to do some prep, we want to do some instruction ahead of time, but letting them know, hey, these are the common messages that you can receive either via text, either online, and it means that people are trying to scam you in some way or another, right? And so I think if we don't create that type of exposure, then we're not going to be able to teach, and then your child's not going to know how to respond when those situations come up.
Yeah. Well, and I'm thinking of Jay, Aaron, and was always so friendly. I'm sure, do you worry about him just going along with somebody? And this is where the QR code would be helpful, but also just monitoring where they are and what they're doing.
Well, for Jay, he has moderate to severe autism, so he always has a one-on-one with him. So
Uh-huh.
it's a much different situation. But yeah, he was in a store the other day and he was a little bit behind his dad, and he walked over to one of the people that worked there and put his hand out. The person didn't know what to do. Like, so my husband's like, he just wants to shake your hand. But he wants to engage. He wants to have interactions with people, but they he comes about it so differently, people don't know how to respond to it. Yeah.
Does he have friends? I mean, is that
Um,
something cultivated in school or in his wherever he is now?
well, he actually I kept him in karate. I really pushed for it all these years. He actually became a black belt this year. So so that was the group there was kind of his friends, and he's in a day program now, and they're encouraging him to interact with people, and there's actually a girl in there that kind of came over and started stroking his face. So now he's like giving her a flower, and so
Oh,
we're all, it takes a village, right? So his therapist went out and helped him buy the flower, and it's really sweet. We're all trying to make relationships for him.
yeah. Yeah. I'm sure it's for everybody. It's just, even if you have a neurotypical child, you're worried about their relationships with other people. You're always a parent, right? Do you guys have questions for each other? Or any other tidbits that you can sort of give our participants? I think that there are some questions in here for you, mostly around information, like, where they can get information directly to you. And are you open to that?
Yes, I was going to say if I can drop my email in the should I do it in the chat or the Q&A? And if folks want to reach out to me, I'm happy to correspond either through email or have a call with folks.
Yeah, I think your information is in the resources.
Oh, perfect.
I believe so, Sue. Is that right?
I'll double check the slides. I'll include everyone's email address.
Oh, thank you.
That would be great because you guys are the local experts. Nathan's a great resource, but he's across the country. And so you guys are all right here. And I think it's important that our participants know what's local and helpful and so on. Okay, so now I think we are moving on to the next panel. Or next speaker, actually. Sue, is that right? So
Right.
thank you very much, all of you. This was really informative. Great to see you. I'm so happy to see you, Erin. And
Me too.
who knew, right? Many years ago. Okay, take care all. Thank you.
Thank
Right.
you.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Dr. Kasri. Okay, so next up is we're going to be covering another critical topic within safety, which is abuse prevention. We are fortunate to have Ms. Carrie Branich with us today to share her expertise. Ms. Branich has over 28 years of experience in the nonprofit and special education sectors, working closely with families and individuals in the Alta California Regional Center and Self-Determination Program communities. She currently serves as program manager for Three Strands Global Foundation's Safe Life program, which focuses on preventing abuse through education and skill building. We're honored to have her with us today. Please welcome Ms. Branich. There we see her slides. Carrie, are you able to turn on your camera and your mic?
There we go. All right. So thank you, Sue, and thank you guys for having me here today. I am Carrie Branich, and I am the program manager for Safe Life at Three Strands Global Foundation. We do specialize in providing abuse prevention and education services to individuals with disabilities. as that is one of my roles. I think one of my proudest and most honorable roles is I am a mom to my son, who's 16 years old and does have autism as well. I've been asked to speak, as Sue said, to talk about abuse. And I recognize that discussing abuse is never easy, as it's a powerful and an uncomfortable topic. Abuse comes in many forms and does not discriminate based on age, gender, ability, or disability. So to start, I thought we'd start off with the definition of abuse. So abuse is the intentional mistreatment of another person. It can take many forms, often multiple forms at once, and occurs when someone uses their power, control, or trust over another person for their own gain. Or, as one of my Safe Life students has said, abuse is someone that is hurting you on purpose. So I love that definition. When teaching individuals with disabilities about abuse, it's important to break down the different types of abuse and explain what each one might look like in a relationship. So understanding the various forms of abuse helps individuals recognize harmful behavior and protect themselves against different types of abuse. So I've listed the top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, which is physical, emotional, cyber, sexual, neglect, fiduciary, or self. And I believe you get copies of this, so I won't go into the definitions, but you will have that when you get your slides. So when talking about abuse, it's important to use age-appropriate examples to help illustrate the different types of abuse and consistently reinforce that abuse is never okay. It's just as important to talk about what is not abuse. Abuse is not an accident or a consequence for bad behavior. We need to make clear that not every difficult situation or conflict in a relationship is abusive. These conversations should take place regularly and over time. Their purpose is to educate and inform, not to create fear or make someone anxious. The goal is to empower the individuals with the knowledge and confidence to recognize what is acceptable behavior and what is not. So according to the Office of Victims of Crime, individuals with disabilities are 4 to 10 times more likely to be victims of abuse than those without disabilities. And shockingly, more than 50% of victims with disabilities never seek legal assistance or treatment, leaving many cases unreported and unaddressed. Children with disabilities are especially vulnerable, being more than 3 times more likely to be abused than their peers without disabilities. And on top of physical and emotional abuse, individuals with disabilities are also disproportionately affected by online dangers, as Kimberly was talking about. 30 to 40% of individuals with disabilities have fallen victim to online scams, and approximately 25% have been manipulated into online activities that turn them into the perpetrators, often without even fully understanding the consequences. If these statistics weren't alarming enough, consider this, that 39 to 68% of girls and 16 to 30% of boys with disabilities are subjected to sexual abuse, often before they even turn 18. These numbers are already shocking, but the reality is they may even be higher. Many reports suggest that due to a lack of proper reporting mechanisms and insufficient resources for victims with disabilities, much of the abuse goes unnoticed, unreported, or deemed unfounded. Talking about abuse brings awareness, protection, and prevention. The more we talk about it, the more we arm ourselves and our children with the tools to recognize and stop it before it can escalate. So some of the risks that we look at is individuals with disabilities face a higher risk of abuse due to several key factors. For instance, limited communication can make it harder for them to express what's happening. Certain living situations like being isolated or overly dependent on others can make them more vulnerable. Additionally, many individuals with disabilities are trying to fit into a world that doesn't always accommodate them, which can create feelings of low self-esteem or even the belief that they deserve the abuse. And in some cases, they might even feel that one form of abuse is easier to tolerate than another. I have an example of, I worked with an adult client in our Safe Life classes, and she was physically and emotionally in an abusive relationship. She told me flat out, well, at least he doesn't sexually abuse me like my ex. In that moment, she seemed to believe that being physically abused by her current boyfriend was somehow better than the sexual abuse she had endured with her previous partner. This mindset stemmed from the belief that any relationship, no matter how harmful, was better than being alone. This student knew what abuse was and could identify it, but without education on what a healthy relationship looked like, she didn't have the framework to see that she deserved better. More often than not, individuals with disabilities may identify a stranger as a potential abuser. However, the shocking truth is that strangers are actually the least likely perpetrators. In reality, 92 to 99% of abusers are known to the victim. This is why it's so important to focus on educating individuals with disabilities about healthy relationships, boundaries, and personal safety. By doing so, we empower them to recognize and avoid potential abuse, even when it comes from someone they know or trust. So I put out some perpetrator tactics here. And so perpetrators are highly skilled at manipulating and controlling others. Their actions and thought process may seem incomprehensible to those on the outside, but they are often calculated and deliberate. While they view individuals with disabilities as weak or vulnerable, I see those same individuals as incredibly strong and courageous. Predators target individuals with disabilities because they believe these victims are easy targets. They understand that the likelihood of the abuse being reported is low. This belief that their action will go unnoticed or unchallenged is what drives them to act without fear of consequence. Individuals with disabilities often have strong support network, but predators are skilled at isolating them from those who care. They work to create distance between the victim and their support system, often convincing the victim they no longer need help, leading them to leave safe relationships or situations. One common tactic predators use is love bombing, and this is flooding the victim with excessive affection and praise to create an emotional dependency. This makes the victim feel special and chosen, building a strong emotional bond that clouds their ability to recognize the manipulation. And another common tactic is grooming. And grooming is when a predator builds an emotional connection with the victim by listening, agreeing, and meeting emotional needs. They isolate the victim and then begin to abuse. They usually use fear and shame to maintain control and silence. In about 95% of abuse cases, grooming is the key factor. The abusers work for months, sometimes even years, gradually building trust, creating a false sense of security, and manipulating the victim into thinking they are the only one who truly cares or understands them. So signs of abuse in our population, this can be very difficult to identify, as many of the behaviors that indicate abuse there are also common coping mechanisms for individuals with disabilities. So for example, changes in routine like excessive or insufficient showering, aversions to certain foods, or changes in sleep patterns. This may be a part of their daily experience. Depression, anxiety, difficulty sleeping, meltdowns and stimming are also common behaviors that may occur without indicating abuse. This is why I totally recommend trusting your instincts is just as important, if not more so, than checking off a list of signs. If something feels off, or if a behavior starts to get worse over time, or appears to be directed toward a specific person or situation, it's worth investigating further. No one knows your child or adult child better than you do. If something doesn't feel right, it's okay to dig deeper, ask questions, investigate in ways that make sense for your child. So let's discuss ways that we can make a difference and create change in addressing abuse. So one key way to do this, and this is something that we work on a lot in our Safe Life classes, is by focusing on personal boundaries. So personal boundaries are about self-protection and understanding your own limits. By teaching individuals to recognize and set their boundaries, we empower them to protect themselves and avoid harmful situations. Boundaries can be verbal or nonverbal. For example, a child may turn away from a hug to signal they don't want to be touched. It's important for children to learn early on that their body belongs to them and that they have the right to set boundaries based on what makes them feel comfortable. As they develop their own boundaries, children also need to understand that others have boundaries too. Someone else's boundaries may look different from their own, and that's perfectly okay. Personal boundaries can be confusing for children because as parents or educators, we teach them to respect authority and follow directions. Individuals are told to give Aunt Mary a hug even if they don't want to, or told they are being rude if they don't comply. However, setting boundaries isn't a sign of disrespect. In fact, it empowers individuals to make choices about what feels right for them, helping them assert their own comfort levels. Teaching kids that it's okay to say no to anything that doesn't feel right is a valuable tool for their growth and self-confidence. Modeling boundaries is a powerful way to teach individuals how to set and assert their own limits. For instance, you can role play various scenarios, such as asking for permission before giving a hug, and encourage them to respond with no or yes as appropriate. This helps them practice recognizing and respecting personal boundaries. Setting personal boundaries empowers them to make choices about who enters their space, strengthening their critical thinking, and lays the foundation for healthy relationships. Once an individual understands their own boundaries, they can more easily respect others and recognize when something feels wrong, giving them the confidence to say no. By learning to recognize, set, and respect boundaries, individuals become more assertive in navigating relationships, whether with friends, family, or strangers. These lessons help build safe, respectful, and healthy interactions that last a lifetime. Another way thing we talk about when creating change is empowering individuals is to help them identify who their safe adults are in their lives. We use different terms: safe adult, safe person, depending on our adult classes, sometimes they're like, I'm an adult. Why am I going to a safe adult? So different lingo for different ages is obviously okay. But most of us have a friend or a spouse that we feel comfortable confiding in. And individuals with disabilities need that same type of support and outlet. They must be able to identify those safe adults in their lives. A safe adult is someone that they can turn to and talk about anything without fear of judgment or punishment. Unlike a parent who may immediately take protective or corrective action, a safe adult helps the individual navigate the issue and process their feelings. That doesn't mean that the parent is not a safe adult. So a safe adult role would look a little differently than a parent, and I'll go into our reporting when I talk about reporting, but a parent is usually a safe adult for most people. One of the most important things for a safe adult to remember is the rule of no secrets. It's crucial that children understand that their safety comes first and that any secret that may harm them or others needs to be shared with the appropriate people. And kids also have a role in this relationship. They need to know how to contact their safe person. They need to recognize that safe people are there to support them, not make them feel bad, and understand that a safe adult will not keep harmful secrets. Additionally, when reporting or talking to a safe person, kids need to stick to the topic and provide accurate information, which helps create a space for honest and helpful communication. And again, those things, sticking to a topic and providing accurate information are things that we teach when reporting, which is, I think, the next slide. So another powerful way to create change is by helping individuals express their feelings. And when we understand our emotions and recognize that we control them, I feel statements can help us identify both the feeling and its cause. The first step in this process is helping individuals identify their feelings. For example, if my child said, "I feel happy," I would validate that feeling by saying, "I'm so glad you feel happy." Once the feeling is identified, the next step is to understand the cause. You do this by asking, "Why do you feel happy?" This will help them connect the feeling to an event or experience, like, "I feel happy because I got to go to the park." This connection between feelings and their triggers is key to building emotional awareness. As individuals begin to recognize and understand their emotions, they can start making decisions about what feels right and what doesn't. It's important to teach them that it's okay to say no if something feels uncomfortable or wrong, especially when interacting with others. Recognizing feelings of discomfort or unease allows them to set personal boundaries and assert themselves, particularly in situations where they might feel pressured or uncertain. It is also vital to emphasize that all feelings are valid. For example, in our Safe Life classes, we ask, "Is it okay to be mad?" And the common response is usually a loud no. But the reality is, it is okay to feel angry. It is a natural emotion, which is important, though. What's important, though, is how they express that anger. Throwing an iPad in frustration might be the emotion, but it's not a healthy way to express it. Teaching individuals that it's okay to feel, but essential to express those feelings constructively, is an important step to emotional growth. As with personal boundaries, modeling these interactions with an individual, providing coping mechanisms, and practicing "I feel" statements with appropriate responses outside of the situation are great ways to practice this skill. I'm going to kind of speed up because I'm looking at the time. Reporting. So as I mentioned, reporting is an important thing that we use or that we teach often in our Safe Life classes. So reporting is a more structured conversation. We're trying to, keep a focus on what the story is or what they're trying to tell us. We oftentimes say to write it down, as a safe adult, write down what the report is so it can be saved and referred to later. And followed up on at a later time. Reporting should definitely be the who, what, when, why, and where of whatever the situation is. The safe adults, so children learn about personal boundaries and identifying safe adults. They gradually build the skills to report in a structured way. So again, this is something that's happening over time as little kids all the way through adulthood. Reporting can be very helpful in focusing on what the problem is and problem solving. The safe adult's role while listening to a report is to offer support, listen without judgment, and empower the person reporting to take the lead in problem solving. I think that's one of the most important things with reporting is asking how you can help them. So they continue to be in charge of whatever whatever the steps needed to be taken are, they're able to say, "This is what I want to happen." It's also important to look back at that, a couple weeks later, a week later, whatever, and say, "Okay, ABC was done. Did you talk to this person? I talked to that person. Did we solve the problem? Is it still happening? Where are we at with it?" So reporting is a great way to talk about problems or talk about situations that they may not know how to handle on their own. Of course, there's barriers with reporting. So we're creating the safe person and a safe place and a safe way of communicating so that the individual can share a problem, make a plan to solve it, and then follow up to see if the plan worked. This process not only helps them express what's happening, but also empowers them to take control of the situation with support. Unfortunately, there are many reasons why individuals with disabilities may choose not to report. The first three that often come up are embarrassment, shame, or fear of not being believed. Those alone stop most people from speaking up, but other reasons include the fear of losing independence, feeling overstimulated, being blamed or criticized, threats from the abuser, or simply not realizing that what's happening is wrong. But there is good news, and that is barriers can be broken. And that's what we're trying to do. We're creating change over time, and change does take time and practice and education. It requires us to have open, honest conversations about difficult topics. And only by talking about these hard issues can we help create lasting change. So we've covered the important topics like personal boundaries, safe adults, I feel statements, and reporting. Each of these helps to build confidence, encouragement, and advocacy skills for individuals with disabilities. Consent, which is closely related to personal boundaries. Personal boundaries is about self-protection and setting limits, where consent is about agreeing to something with another person. An individual with a disability not only has the ability to give consent, but they also have the right to give it. Consent is an essential part of forming healthy relationships, and it relies on mutual respect and understanding. It's just as important for an individual to say no as it is for them to say yes. When we instruct an individual to give Mrs. Sam a hug, even if they don't want to, we send a harmful message. We're telling them that their feeling doesn't matter and teaching them that even when they say no, they still have to comply. This undermines their right to set boundaries and sends the dangerous message that their personal boundaries aren't respected. Ultimately, we're teaching them that abuse is acceptable. As I mentioned, modeling personal boundaries and giving consent is an important way for individuals to learn. Instead of telling them to give Mrs. Sam a hug, you can ask, do you want to give Mrs. Sam a hug? This empowers them to make their own choices and practice giving consent. Role playing, like I think Kimberly mentioned, role playing these situations also works wonders. We love role playing and save life. So remember, 92 to 99% of perpetrators are someone the victims know. This is why it's not enough to just talk about stranger danger. In Safe Life, we use the 3 A's of abuse to help individuals understand its complexities. So we always say anyone can be abusive, and that includes anyone, teachers, friends, family members, strangers. We sit here and we name off a list of anyone and we want them to acknowledge that, yes, that person can be abusive. We also say abuse can happen anywhere. It doesn't just happen behind closed doors. It can occur in cars, homes, parks, public spaces, again, anywhere. And abuse can happen anytime. That's day or night. Many of our Safe Life students might say abuse doesn't happen at night because people are sleeping. And unfortunately, the sad truth is that a perpetrator may take advantage of the fact that people are asleep, using that time to carry out their abusive actions. It's important to stress that abuse can happen when we least expect it, and it's crucial to create awareness about the potentials for harm in any setting and at any time. And Kimberly hit on a lot of these already, but for individual, I'll kind of just wrap, these are my last few, so I'll just wrap up with this as well, but you might have heard it from Kimberly already. But for many individuals, both with and without disabilities, being online has become an important way to socialize and connect. Whether it's playing games like Roblox or browsing social media, online use is on the rise and individuals find comfort and enjoyment in these digital spaces. The online world can offer them a sense of safety and control because they can navigate environments where they feel accepted for who they are. So parents, my big warning, kids are often much more skilled at navigating online spaces than we might think. They are learning how to use these platforms, and sometimes they have more knowledge about how to stay engaged in these spaces than we do. It's essential to stay informed and have open conversations about online safety and boundaries. So important. There are many parental control apps available that can help monitor what kids are doing online. And while those tools can be useful, they don't always catch everything that might be inappropriate or unacceptable. So one of the biggest reasons kids feel safe online is because they have a false sense of who is really on the other side of the screen. It's easy for kids to assume that everyone online is just like them, but obviously that's not always the case. This is why it's so important to help our kids stay safe online. One way to do this is by encouraging them to create an online identity. They should use a name that isn't connected to their real name or age. For instance, if your son's name is Joe Smith, his online username shouldn't be something like Joe Smith 2008. This would reveal both his full name and his birth year. So instead, help them come up with a fun or creative name that isn't tied to their personal information. Obviously, that would be different. Kimberly was talking about dating apps and dating things, and that's probably a different situation than this particular one. This would be like playing games or using social media or just kind of being online, using YouTube, things like that. It's also important to know which online apps are being used. Many local police department websites list apps that have been targeted by predators. So stay informed about the potential risks and make sure the individual understands the differences between private and public information. That's really important, as like Kimberly said as well. Private and public information, they need to know that whatever they put online is public. It is out there and it will never go away. Every game has a chat feature, so check these regularly to see what's being said. Educate both yourself and the individual about how to block, delete, and report inappropriate users or people who are bullying or saying, inappropriate things online. Know what they are doing online. Ask them about the games they're playing and the apps they're using, and have them show you how to use the apps or play the games. By being involved and staying informed, you can better guide them in navigating the digital world safely. Set online boundaries, just like we establish rules for behavior in the real world. Individuals need clear guidelines about what's okay and not okay online. And remember, individuals know how to navigate online spaces better than we might think. So it's important to stay involved and keep that conversation open. I don't know how many times I've heard a parent say, oh, my kid doesn't even know how to get online. And yet they know how to get on, they know how to use their camera, they know how to turn on their mic, they know how to search for a video. So they do know, they really know more than what we might think or understand. And to kind of just wrap up, I just want to throw this in here. So I'm sure we all have had some kind of scam, whether it's an email, text, letter, or phone call. They're all over the place. They're happening all the time. For an example, my own personal examples, every day, literally every day, I get a text from Chase Bank claiming that my account has been compromised and urging me to call immediately to fix the problem. My first instinct is to, of course, panic because, oh my gosh, my bank account got hacked. But then I remember I don't even have a Chase Bank account. So these scam messages look incredibly legitimate. Their logos appear authentic. The wording sounds official and urgent. And the purpose is to make you feel like you've done something wrong. So you end up calling the number they provide to fix the issue. It's designated to trick you into acting quickly and without thinking. So you all will have a copy of this printout, I believe, in your materials, but I wanted to highlight the one in the middle of the page when you see it. So this example, I just wanted to point out what love bombing manipulation tactic might looks like. So in this text message right in the middle, it says the scammer quickly uses flattery to draw the person in, telling them how amazing they are and how much they're falling for them. And by the third text, The perpetrator has already professed their feelings, saying they don't want to lose the person. This fast-paced manipulation is designed to create an emotional connection and make the victim feel special, which in turn makes them more vulnerable to further exploitation. So as a reminder, back from my first slide, is talking about abuse should take place regularly and over time. This purpose is to educate and inform, not to create fear or make someone anxious. The goal is to empower individuals with the knowledge and confidence to recognize what is acceptable behavior and what is not. Okay, so I hope you guys found that helpful. Thank you so much for your time. We'll go back to Sue.
Yeah, so we have some questions in the Q&A. Anna, she asked a very important question. So one of the biggest barriers to abuse reporting is the individual's ability to understand what's going on and to communicate that, especially if they have severe autism or are minimally verbal or have intellectual disabilities. So what advice do you have for parents with children who are more severely impacted by their disability? How can they protect them from potential physical, emotional, and sexual abuse?
That's a great question. So a lot of times we use, I don't know if I share this, if it'll share to my screen. It won't. Okay. I can send this to Sue maybe, and if Sue, if you can add it to their, if it's not too late to add to their packet. But what we teach in Safe Life is using pictures. So some people have, if they have a communication device or if they don't use a communication device, pictures in a lot of ways will help tell a story. Again, practicing this all the time. Practice with things that are good, things that are bad, things that are happening. We want to use this in an everyday or every other day situation. So we're getting used to telling about a situation. So we do use a report form. We call it a report form here with Safe Life. And that's just, and the pictures are all there, and they're just literally pointing to the picture of a sad face, pointing to a picture of a happy face. And you're just kind of walking them through each who, what, when, why, where situation. As families or as parents, I would say to create your own. I mean, you can definitely use their own pictures of what they might look like when they're happy, what they look like when they're sad. And that way they can start identifying, oh yeah, I'm happy, and I am happy because I got my iPad, whatever the situation is. So you want to start to identify them. You want them to be able to identify they're happy and what's causing that, or they're sad and what happened with that. And with those report forms, it's all paper, it's all written out or online, whatever's easier, whatever you guys use. But where they're actually just pointing to identify or pointing to tell a story of what's going on. Even our nonverbal guys, they can learn to say no. In classes, we teach having the hand up, so creating that barrier. If something is not feeling right, and they know that it's not feeling right, if something, whatever it is, whether it's abuse or not, is not feeling right to them, teaching them that creating that space between you and somebody, if they're not verbally able to say no, having that hand gesture where it's creating that barrier between them and another person. And that's very appropriate because again, that's keeping their in a situation where they have control over, even if it's something, again, that's not abusive, it's teaching them that they have control over, I don't want that person here, or I don't want that person in my space. It's letting them have control and make those decisions for themselves.
Okay, Carrie, if you have like the additional tools and resources, definitely email us and we'll include.
I do, yeah. I can send one as an example. So I'll send one to you guys for an example. I do, like I said, I do think making kind of I'll send this as like the frame. But it works really well when you customize it to your child or your family. That way they're actually seeing, happy faces and sad faces, and identifying those feelings. Again, takes time to do, work and time to do, but if they can get to that point where they can identify, oh, this is something that makes me happy or makes me feel good, and this is what it was that makes me feel good, that's a good way to start using that report idea.
Great. Our next question is from Angela. Would it be considered abuse when a school staff member asks a student to look at their cell phone and the student allows it due to their autism? They couldn't refuse because they don't know how to advocate for their personal rights. How can we help in school settings because they are very vulnerable? Thank you.
I think this is the same thing with personal boundaries and consent. As I said, is unfortunately it's a hard thing to educate our kids on, because as any parent I think does, you teach your kid to respect a teacher, or if a teacher asks you something, you're supposed to do it, right? Like that's the authority and that's what you're supposed to do. But unfortunately, there is that side where things are maybe not appropriate. Like personally, I would say no, that teacher or that staff member shouldn't have been asking for their phone. That's their personal thing. So a couple things is teaching those personal boundaries, doing that consent, practicing consent, that they can say no. It's okay. If someone asks for your phone and you don't want to share your phone, it is really okay to say no. And role playing that situation. We we have ones that we have role played situations, and we'll say, can we have your phone? And they go, no, as they hand over their phone. So we really want to role play situations where they're saying no and keeping their phone in their pocket. Like it's not even an option. No is no, and you're not going to get my phone. So creating and role playing those situations with your kid, about their personal property, and just educating them on what is their personal property. Their phone, their wallets, their clothes, their backpack, their jacket, that belongs to them. And it really, nobody should be asking for that. And it's really their decision if they want to give that information or share that information. One thing in Safe Life, I mean, we kind of go above, because it is hard to tell if someone is just asking to use it just to use it, or someone asking to use it so they can take it, or take advantage of the situation. And because we don't know, that might be hard to figure out. We kind of go overboard and say, no, it's just no. That's my personal stuff. That's my personal phone. That's mine. It belongs to me. So I'm not going to share it. So I would just start practicing with them. Role playing. Role playing is a big usually plus for a lot of people. Role playing those situations, practice with them saying no, letting them know it's okay to say no, but not no as you're handing over the phone. Make sure they're saying no and that their phone is staying in their pocket or in their backpack or wherever their phone is supposed to be.
Great. I think this is going to be our last question. It's from a Korean speaking parent, so I'll interpret the response after you give the answer. So she asked, if I find out that there has been abuse or neglect, who should I report to and to which institution?
And that's a great question as well. And that actually is in my resources page, which you guys will get a copy of that as well. So depending on where you're at, if they're in school, of course, if they're in school, it would first go to the principal of the school, any administration for the school district, police, local police department. Usually the police department have their own step. I mean, each police department that I've kind of had contact with is different. So usually a local police department will have their own steps as to, what needs to go next or who else should be included in the report. If it's your own personal child, probably not, CPS or APS unless the local police suggest that. I mean, if someone else is reporting abuse for your child, then they would contact CPS or APS. But I would definitely start with the school district and your local police department.
네. 네, 셀리님께 답변 드리자면 리소스 페이지 보내드릴 거니까 그거 보시고요. 그 다음에 학교에서 뭔가 인시던트가 있었을 경우에 교장과 교감 선생님에게 알려드리고요. 그 다음에 또 경찰, 로컬 폴리스 디파먼트에다가 리포트를 하시면은 다음 단계에 대해서 경찰들이 그걸 다 가지고 있으니까 가이드를 해드릴 겁니다. 그 다음에 본인 아이일 경우에는 CPS에게 연락하는 게 아니라요. CPS는 다른 가정의 아이가 그런 니글렉트가 있었다고 생각하면은 거기에다가 연락을 주시면 됩니다. Okay, I think that's it for the Q&A. Thank you so much, Carrie. And this was such an informative presentation. And like you said, it could be an uncomfortable topic for many people, but it's just so important to have this conversation with their loved ones so they can.
Very important. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. Great. Next up is a panel discussion with our self-advocates who will share their lived experiences and insights on safety from their perspective. And moderating this session is Robin Shipley, co-founder of Transitions Consulting with over 20 years. Hello, Robin. She has over 20 years of experience in special education, and Robin has dedicated her career to supporting neurodiverse youth, teens, and young adults. Through Transitions, she works extensively on career development, independent living skills, and employment training. And we're so excited to hear from Robin and our panelists, Santiago, Delvin, and Anna.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for the introduction. Let's get our panelists. There we see them. Hi, Delvin. Hi, Anna.
Hello.
Santiago, are you there with us?
Hello.
We see you. Okay, beautiful. All right. So hello, everybody. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm really excited to introduce to you these amazing panelists. So I'm going to have them introduce themselves, and then we'll get right into some questions and hear perspectives. So Anna, would you like to introduce yourself?
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Anna Tom, and I am currently in the Evolve program that Robin is running. I went through their year program and an internship, and currently I'm working on college after doing a psychology internship that I really enjoyed. And I decided to pursue that in college. Thank you for having me.
Beautiful, Anna. Santiago, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Santiago Villalobos. I am an advocacy member at SLARC and also a self-determination local advisory committee at SLARC at South Central LA Regional Center. I'm currently going back to school to get a degree in psychology to either become a social worker or open up my own business for the autism spectrum and IDD.
Excellent. Such a pleasure to meet you, Santiago. And Delvin, want to share a little bit about you?
My name is Delvin Pitts. I am part of the Evolve program, and I'm currently looking for an internship in wildlife or conservation.
Beautiful. It's lovely to have all of you. Thank you so much. So we put together some questions that we'd love you guys to just give your thoughts on as guides for parents and caregivers to just be thinking about with regard to safety. Anna, would you, we'll kind of go in order, Anna, Santiago, and then Delvin. So our first question is, what are some challenges that you've faced in ensuring your own personal safety in different environments like school, work, and public spaces?
All right. For me, I have a lot of anxiety, so I don't really put myself out in a lot of the situations that are considered dangerous. But in a school setting, I have had a lot of difficulty with figuring out the difference between being nice and flirting, because a lot of the times I've had a lot of friendships where I thought I was being nice, but it was being misinterpreted as wanting a romantic relationship. And so I've had to set a lot of hard boundaries about that. I personally was never in any danger, but it's very easy to imagine how that could become a dangerous situation. So, uh, there's a lot of times where I've had to set uncomfortable boundaries, and I don't think if I had support for that, it may have gone a lot different. Um, yeah, that's
No, that's such a good point, Anna. And it takes a lot of courage to have that kind of advocacy with peers. It's a whole different kind of advocacy, right? Yeah. Okay, Santiago, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I also have a problem with Anna. I mean, I agree with Anna about the worry about that because sometimes myself, I may come across as nice, but people say I'm mean. And sometimes when I do have friends I kind of like text too much and then they don't text back. So sometimes for me, it's like, am I doing it too much like that? And also, when I go out and especially in different environments, I worry about like what happens if something happens, like an earthquake or a fire, and especially in a place I'm not familiar with.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot to unpack there, but it
Yeah.
is about that thinking about environment as well as those relationships, right? What are those boundaries?
Mhm.
Delvin, what do you think?
For me, is catastrophizing or overthinking about the dangers that are outside my comfort zone, stuff like natural disasters or people who are, dangerous and it could hurt me. Stuff like that make me worried and scared of going outside and what 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 could be out there.
Right. It sounds like, guys, like, it is a lot of overthinking and some of it's necessary, right? Because
Yeah.
that's how you figure out what boundaries you need. But you're right, Delv, I can see how it can cause you to not want to take risks, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
So, all right, thank you guys. Another question for you is, are there any safety tools or strategies that have been particularly helpful to you? Anna, do you want to start?
well, I often have a lot of black and white thinking that I have to work on, but in certain situations for helping my anxiety, black and white thinking does help because uh as Delvin and Santiago mentioned, catastrophizing is something I also do a lot. And when you put okay, what is catastrophizing and what is actually going most likely to happen as black and white thinking, it helps make more sense of, okay, if I go outside, there could be an earthquake, but most likely it's not going to be an earthquake. Thinking in facts really helps. Again, with anxiety, I also go through a lot of what if scenarios and plan for the worst. And sometimes, yes, it's helpful, but a lot of the times it's a bit too much for my brain. So there's trying to figure out like a balance between making safety plans and then overthinking. Um, I also carry a utility tool around, like a Swiss Army knife with the screwdriver and scissors and stuff. But I also caution with that too, because there's a period of my life where I was not very mentally stable. So that could also become a danger having something like that. Uh, I know I kind of went a little off topic, but I guess rounding it all up is it's important to make safety plans and that helps my anxiety, but I also have to work on making sure making safety plans doesn't take over the rest of my life.
It's that idea of the difference between a tool and a trap, right? Things can feel like tools, and then all of a sudden you realize it kind of trapped you. And the physical thing, like you talked about that safety tool, you know, people use them, and sometimes they're about for us to just know we have it, not that you would necessarily use it. It's just that other thing,
Yeah,
right?
that's what I usually have it in my backpack for or something.
I
I
get
mean,
that.
it is also fun to be like, oh yeah, I have a screwdriver, I can help. But
Get you. Santiago, what's your thoughts about safety tools or strategies that have been helpful?
Well, well, I carry around my phone all the time when I go out, just in case I need to call someone or find directions to a police station. And as for like the tools that I have, I'm not very comfortable using it, so I prefer not to carry those. But maybe maybe I'm interested in a pepper spray or something like that, just in case.
I think with all of those things, guys, right, it's all about training. Like,
Yeah.
isn't it's one thing, it's like having a stress ball or something, you know how to use those to be able to help support you and making you feel more regulated. But anything like that, you always want to make sure that you are educated and you know what to do. Um, but I love the critical thinking, right? In terms of thinking, weighing your pros and cons. And Santiago, you had mentioned once before to me, you talked about your safe zones. Can you talk a little bit about that? Always knowing where your safe zones are?
Yeah, to me, like the safe zone is like the police station or the nearest safe zones, usually about my house or I'm gonna say like a 1 or 2 block radius. And if I go outside that safe zone, or at least go to the safe zone, I know I'm safe and I can like call the police or something like that from there.
Great. Thank you. Delvin, what are you thinking in terms of safety tools and strategies?
Um, for safety tools, uh how should I say, there was a time that me and my family got our identity stolen. Our computers, all of our systems got hacked by people who trying to steal our money and ruin our lives. We luckily got it back, and not like all of our money are still intact. It's just what we use to protect ourselves is like, protect security software for computers or VPNs to hide, our data somewhere else so they won't, try and steal our stuff again. It was a very horrifying thing that happened to us. We could have lost everything. Our lives could have been ruined. And we were just super lucky. And for how should I say, for catastrophizing, I just try my best to not overthink. I just focus on the task or the reason why I go outside. You know, just try to enjoy life and try to focus what's in front of me. That's what I do, try to calm myself down.
You guys are talking a lot about, well, first of all, Devin, I'm so sorry that that happened to you and your family. That's pretty
Hmm.
scary stuff. Um, I think you guys are talking so much about emotional safety and planning, right? Being aware of your own thinking. And then, Santiago, you spoke about knowing about your physical boundaries. So those are really great tools and strategies, guys. And then as well as cyber, right? Security, which is a whole nother perspective. Guys, my next question is really about what your thoughts are on helping families and caregivers or community members better support safety with of autistic individuals. Anna, what do you think about that?
Yeah. I know there's a lot of like social cues and quote unquote rules that are thought of as really common knowledge, so no one really says it outright. Like, kind of what really helps me if someone says things super direct, like really specific, because I have difficulty reading in between the lines. I know this isn't really a safety example, but what really confuses me is when like you go to a party or something and the host says no gifts, but everyone brings gifts anyway. Uh, if you've kind of like stuff like that, kind of basic stuff that everyone assumes you already know, I might not. Um, sorry, let me look at my notes. Even if you think you're saying too much, you're probably not because it's very helpful for me to know everything. Um, also, money value, I think should be really emphasized because there was one time I experienced a guy uh overspend his money on food because I don't think he had much awareness of how much food was supposed to cost, and then people had to cover his dinner. Um, Money value, according to like objects and things, can also be pretty tricky. Um, yeah,
And
I think I kind of rambled a bit,
no,
but
you didn't, because you're bringing up beautiful points, Anna. It's things about how do people support safety, and it's education, right? And it's all of those things that people take for granted. So that what you just shared
yeah,
is really important about teaching guidelines, because all of those can open you up to being vulnerable.
when you're a kid, you get told to look both ways before you cross the crosswalk, but what's not also said is people in the right turn lane can also often go in the crosswalk when you're still in the crosswalk, and that's not something that's always outright said.
Beautiful.
And so I need that outright said.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Santiago, what do you think in terms of how family members and community members can support the safety of individuals with autism?
Well, to me, I would say like teach them to look around their surroundings and also teach them about their safe zones. Like if they're in school, what's the radius of the safe zone and in their homes too. And also try to give them like a phone so they can contact them. If they're like too young, maybe like 4, 5, 6, like maybe like one of those things that what's it called? Like a communicator or something? Not a communicator, like
Like
angel
a,
sense.
So
right.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Beautiful. What about for you, Delvin? What are you thinking?
Um, Teaching your kids self-awareness, about their surroundings and teaching them to catch themselves while thinking so they don't overthink about the what ifs and, try and empower them on this, what kind of skills they need to, to survive the world today.
Okay, a lot of education,
yeah.
right? A lot of information.
Also touching on that point, I know that a lot of people on the spectrum, myself included, often mask or copy other people to fit in or, stay below the radar. And a lot of people, when they're walking or in the streets, they've got headphones in or they're looking down at their phones. And more of being able to think, emphasizing be able to make proper choices that kind of go outside the masking because nowadays everyone has like music in while they're walking or crossing the street. And I live by a school, and whenever all these high schoolers cross the crosswalk, they're always looking down at their phones. So I would emphasize being able to like critically and use common sense for themselves rather than like it's not a bad thing to follow the crowd, but I would rather someone look up when they're in the crosswalk, if that makes sense.
Makes complete sense, and it's beautiful advice. Thank you, guys. So on that, what advice would you give other individuals about speaking up about their own safety needs? What do you think, Anna?
Um, so as I mentioned before, I have a lot of like catastrophizing thought. Um, and sometimes like talking out loud and talking out the scenario of what I think might happen versus what will happen is very helpful. Um, and also don't be afraid to actually say something, even if it's scary, like topic wise or feeling wise. There would be times where I wouldn't tell my parents some of the scary thoughts in my head because I was too afraid to worry them. But uh, that's also what parents are for, to help you and take care of you too. Or even if you're not comfortable going to your parents, at least going to someone you trust. Let's see. Also, don't think you're being like too dramatic or overwhelmed about something. Like the worst that can really happen is someone says, "Oh, you are." And then you go, "Oh, okay, got it." Um, because being someone on the spectrum, it's a lot different in I don't want to get too deep on this, but being on the spectrum in quote unquote society is a lot harder than it is for other people. And don't dismiss how I'm feeling just because it doesn't sound normal.
Beautiful. Yeah, nice. Santiago, what do you think?
Well, my advice will be to try for the so for individuals try to speak up for what they need and for their safety needs, like a support service person or a service animal, or maybe something um like a device or something for them. And also I would say or if especially if it's too far or they're not familiar, maybe a support person or a family member can take them to with them just to be safe. And also based on my opinion, I do and make sure that support person knows how to be trained in the autism spectrum or something like that because no, that never happened to me, but I see a lot of other support staff people not really pay attention to them. So that's my concern too.
Beautiful. It's so much about, right? It's about that awareness, but you're right, it is about information and it is a responsibility if you're going to have a support person for them to understand autism, neurodiversity, right? So then they know what to help you pay attention to.
Yeah.
Beautiful, Santiago. Delvin, what are you thinking about advice?
Just trusting yourself when speaking up and always remember that your safety is more important than not advocating.
And I love what you said earlier, Anna, which speaks to Delvin's point, is that there's no such thing as over advocating, right? It's that if you're feeling it, then you say it, right? Which I know is a skill in itself, but it's beautiful to put out there.
Yeah. Um, uh,
We're missing what you're saying, Anna.
oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I have a lot of intrusive thoughts and sometimes they're scary, but it doesn't Oh shoot, I lost my train of thought. Oh no.
That's
Um, right. There's a word I'm looking for. It's not intrusive, but it's unrealistic thoughts of obviously like when I see a plane in the sky, most likely it's not going to blow up and crash into me, but I still feel the emotions of it, whether it's true or not. So it's still valid. It's just not based in reality.
you bring up a really good point. It is about validation, right? We all feel, we all think those things. And it's the idea of saying your thoughts and your feelings aren't wrong. They just are, right? So we don't have a whole lot of time, and I know there might be questions for you guys. So I'm just going to ask this next question and then maybe skip to your final comments. What do you wish more people understood about the safety concerns of individuals with autism? Anna, what do you think?
Uh, I often miss body cues, or over interpret them. And um, so I understand. Sorry, let me start that over. Uh, a lot of people in the spectrum, myself included, miss cues from people like body language. And so sometimes you can misread situations. And while it's not always dangerous, it definitely can form into very dangerous situations. I really appreciate direct communication about that, but also with my anxiety, if there's like too much anxiety, my brain stalls out, so I can't think. So I suppose I would learning how to get a handle on all of the emotions and think critically, but also still having like a healthy awareness.
Love it. What about you, Santiago? What are you thinking that you want people to understand more? Can you turn your mic on? So you're on mute.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I also agree with Anne, like the body cues and their body language. Sometimes, especially people who don't speak, sometimes the person might misunderstand them or something like that for their safety. And so important to pay attention to their body language and their cues because sometimes they might not understand what's going on and they might not be able to talk.
Beautiful. Delvin, what are you thinking?
People with autism might have hard time explaining something. They may also, not know what's dangerous or what's not, um, not safe. They they also have like sensory sensitivities. I don't like loud music, and I also don't like um, bright lights or bright colors. That really hurts my head. It gives me a headache. So, something I think people should know about people with autism is that there are a lot of things they need to learn and need to look out for.
Beautiful. So guys, that's I mean, I know I could go on all day with you guys. You're so amazing. But what I heard a lot is there's so much internally that's going on, right?
Yeah.
And for me as a practitioner, it's so helpful to remember that we need to be doing the work to find out what it is, what's going on with you, rather than assuming, making assumptions of what you need. We need to hear it from you. So thank you for that. Sue, I didn't know if we have time for questions or, where we're at.
Yeah. Are there any questions in the Q&A that you'd like to answer? I think we might have time for like one more.
I noticed a question about service animals that I thought was interesting.
Yeah, go ahead if you'd like to answer.
Oh, I would. I am a very big animal person. Um, and I have a golden retriever lab mix. He's actually underneath my desk right now. Um, he his name is Ben, and I love him. Um, he's not a service animal, but he has been such a big help for my anxiety. Um, I truly think he enriches my life and animals in general. I love when people bring animals onto school campuses in the middle of tests. I think they are wonderful for anxiety. I have a lot of anxiety when I take out the trash in my house, in the dark because I think someone's going to kidnap me. But there was one time where my neighbor's cat came out randomly one time, and I looked at this cat and I was like, oh, I'm okay now. Um, just like the tactile sensoriness of touching or petting an animal is very helpful, I think, for me.
Beautiful. Thank you, Anna. Guys, thank you so much. We so appreciate your insight.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Robin. That was really amazing. We're seeing a lot of positive comments from the audience. And we all
Yay.
so much are self-advocates. So thank you.
Lovely. All right. Okay, guys, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Dana.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Anna,
Thanks.
Delvin,
Thank you.
Santiago.
Sir. I was gonna say, just a reminder for everyone, please fill out the evaluation survey. We would really love your feedback. So it's in the chat. And thank you so much for your attention and engagement. And we hope you have a great rest of your day. Connie, do you have anything to add? No? All right. You're on mute.
Well, I would just say, echo what you said, Sue. Thank you for your participation. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.